Our second speaker is Hasmik Grigoryan. He arrived here from Armenia. He did his PhD degree on the expansion of the crime, and now he is preparing a book on mass violence, and he is going to present a paper on mass suicide during the tragedy of Smyrna.
I want to thank Hrant Foundation for inviting me to this very interesting and important conference. My presentation consists of two parts. The first one is more theoretically, and then I will refer to sources. Though the term suicide originated in the 17th century, practically it was not used till the half of the 18th century. The science studying self-destructive behavior and the prevention of the suicide is called suicidology. This term has begun to be used in the beginning of the 20th century, when the cases of suicides unprecedentedly increased in Europe. The historical roots of suicidology lie in moral philosophy and literature. Even nowadays, suicide is not considered to be only a medical, psychological problem. As far as only human being carries the concepts of life and death, suicide at the same time is not a question of religion, philosophy, sociology, cultural study, and law. Of course, it is not possible to tell when man exactly started to kill himself consciously or intentionally. However, a number of researchers come to prove that in human history, the cases of suicide have been recorded from the archaic period. Such kind of behavior had applied social function and contributed to the preservation of a tribe or a nation. In primitive societies, they resort to suicides when the tribe was under an annihilation threat. During years of hunger, the old usually committed suicides. Perhaps such behavior was formed when biological adaptation was developed and aggression between species was suppressed. The first document on suicide is supposed to be an Egyptian writing known as Debate over Suicide. Myths are mentioned as old written sources on suicide as well. They testified that suicides were widespread acts in Greek and Roman civilizations. In early Greek state, suicide considered to be an acceptable act if it was allowed from the state. In Athens, as well as in other cities, special toxic substances were kept for the citizens who wanted to commit a suicide and were able to justify their wish in front of an areopagus. Such kind of privileges are, as a rule, were given to be convicted criminals. In the Roman Empire, the law of voluntary death became stronger. According to the Codex of Caesar Adrian, the 2nd century, in the case of suicide attempt, legion soldier was condemned to beheaded. In the meanwhile, there were some mitigating factors: fatigue from life, madness, and shame. In the 6th century, the laws of Justinian stated that suicides were condemned acts. As regards the soldiers, suicide was equally accepted as desertion if it was not the result of the unbearable conditions of life. After adopting Christianity as state religion, the strict attitude towards suicide in Roman Empire became more than strong. In 533, the Orleans Temple, those who committed suicide considered criminals, because they wanted to avoid the punishment and refused to bury them according to the Christian traditions. In 563, 1683, Prague Council refused to bury all those who committed suicide, and in 1693, the Church started to refuse not only those who died from the suicide, but also those who tried to commit suicide. According to Christian ideology, suicide was considered a forbidden act. Those who commit suicide were not buried according to the adopted burial ceremonies. But those who commit suicide for defending their honor, belief, were not condemned. Suicides committed by the virgins is not only forgiven, but also sanctified. The topic of suicide became complicated in 19th century Europe as far as moral statistics pointed the increasing amount of suicide cases in France. The growing trend of suicide in Europe perhaps was not a coincidence. After the French Great Revolution, France took the ban of suicide. This resulted in universality and sustainable growth, and they started to find the causes of suicide in the nature of individual, accepting it is a free manifestation of will. Scottish philosopher David Hume talked about the right for self-determination of individual in his essay called On Suicide, where he tried to return the natural freedom to the man. In his work called Suicide, French philosopher and sociologist Durkheim defines two types of suicide, individual and collective, mentioning that the peculiarities of the first case, especially in the framework of the study of its reasons, are under the interest of psychologists, and the second case are under the interest of sociologists. This work, written by Durkheim, became the starting point of sociological and anthropological study of suicide. In some periods of history, suicide acquires mass character, which is called suicide epidemic by the professionals. These kind of flares happened in the cases of great crisis, panic, during and after wars, when the society loses the faith towards the future. Mass suicides are universal in nature and are found in many nations. For example, such reactions are prevalent in huge panics as occurred at the front in Flanders and Caporetto during World War I. During World War II, several examples of mass suicide were observed. When people fail as a group and believe that they have no future, they surrender en masse to death. There are many other historical descriptions of mass suicide after defeat. Plutarch describes such self-slaughter after the Romans under Marius had defended the Cimbres near Versailles. Xenophon tells about a comparable experience in the Anabasis. The Greeks stormed a small fortified settlement, and after their victory, women and children and enemy soldiers threw themselves from the rocks. Loss of freedom and anticipation of torture by the enemy can lead to catastrophic reaction, either murderous rebellion or self-chosen death. Numerous testimonies of witnesses, officers, nurses, and press correspondents prove us that there were a lot of cases of suicide also during the tragedy of Smyrna. According to these eyewitnesses, suicide by drowning has become a commonplace. Crazed mothers are entering the American Blue Jackets to take their babies so that they may be free to drown themselves. The bodies of hundreds of Christians who committed suicide on the first night after the outbreak of the fire have come to the surface of the harbor, giving the desolate city of a ghastlier aspect. In the framework of the present report, I try to figure out the motivations of mass suicides and clarify whether they are universal and have similarities with the motivations of historically recorded cases. The latter would let us speak about the traditional institutes of suicide and understand the cultural basis of it. So I have outlined the following motivations of suicide during the tragedy of Smyrna: panic, preference of being killed, avoidance of dishonor or shame for putting end to sufferings. Panic. British officers who had returned from Smyrna give a description of mass suicides in 1922. In September 18, 1922, Daily News published the history of the British officer Maurice on the horrors of Smyrna. It is very interesting that the title was Panic and Plunder. There we can read, the sense of terror were heightened by the constant explosion of ammunition dumps. Panic-stricken crowds of refugees on the guys became mad with terror, and hundreds flung themselves into the water, whether they could swim or not. Preference of being killed. American consul in Smyrna, George Horton, in his report on Turkey, writes, "Over by Cordelio, a suburb of Smyrna, I saw a young couple wade out into the sea. They were a respectable, attractive pair, and the man was carrying in his arm a small child. As they waded deeper and deeper into the water till it came nearly up to their shoulders, I suddenly realized that they were going to drown themselves. I therefore pushed out to them in a boat, and with the promise that I would do what I could to save them, managed to get them to shore. They explained that they were Armenians, and knowing that the man would certainly be killed, and the wife, who was young and pretty, either outraged or taken into a harem, and their baby left to die, they had determined to drown themselves together. Avoidance of dishonor or shame. Arpine Bartikyan from Afyon Garahisar testified, "My uncle went to Izmir. Then he took us all to Izmir. And then the Milli movement started. Izmir was consumed by flames. They took us with the rest to Paljova and locked us in a wooden hut near the shore. They started to inspect us. They drugged and forcibly took away the pretty girls. I was puny, undersized girl, and hid myself under other skirts. Our Mary had her face blackened with soot, and her hair was shorn, and she had an ugly appearance. An Armenian girl saw that her turn was approaching. She threw herself down from the window, but she did not die. Other gendarmes had been standing under the window. They brought her back after a few days in an unrecognizable state." For putting end to suffering, Daily Telegraph reported on 18 September eyewitnesses' narrative how a party of 800 Christians who took refuge in the Catholic cathedral were horribly massacred, notwithstanding the presence of 2 French officers. A number of women and girls and brothers and husbands committed suicide so as not to survive dishonor. Among the victims were numerous Jews and Europeans. People who managed to get down to the Wavis jumped into the sea to escape the horrors on land and were drowned. Henry Morgenthau writes, "Within a few weeks, 750,000 people were dumped like cattle at the ports of Salonika and Athens, and upon the larger Greek islands of the Aegean Sea, such as Crete, Mytilene, Chios, and Euboea. The condition of these people upon their arrival in Greece was pitiable beyond description. In one case, which I myself beheld 7,000 people were packed into the vessel that would have been crowded with a load of 2,000. In this and many other cases, there was neither food to eat nor water to drink, and in numerous instances the ships were buffeted about for several days at sea before their wretched human cargoes could be brought to land. Typhoid and smallpox swept through the ships, lice invested everywhere. Babies were born on board. Men and women went insane. Some leaped overboard to end their miseries in the sea." Summing up the testimonies of the survivors and witnesses and their perceptions on why the Christians committed suicide during the tragedy of Smyrna, we can emphasize that they correspond to the permitted conditions: madness, shame, unbearable conditions of life. In such suicidal situations created under extreme conditions, the idea of suicide mainly rises all of a sudden, which is immediately followed by the act. A non-pathological reaction is shown, which is formed under religious, psychological, and behavioral thinking. During impulsive circumstantial suicides, the means are also dictated by the circumstances, which is determined by history, cultural, social, religious, aesthetic reasons, and is carried out in a stereotype sense. Thank you.
Teşekkür ederiz.